In 1881, 25 men were sent to the edge of the Arctic Circle with a clear mission, written orders, and a promise that rescue would come every year. By 1884, only 6 were still alive. They waited 2 full winters at 81 degrees north, where temperatures dropped below 40 degrees, believing help was delayed, not destroyed. They didn't know the relief ship meant to save them had already been crushed and sunk by ice in 1883. So they obeyed their orders. When food ran out, they marched 300 kilometers across drifting sea ice, dragging boats and starving bodies south. When the march ended, the dying began. Starvation, disease, executions, and finally acts so desperate they would shock the world. This is not a story about bad luck. It is the true story of the Greely Expedition, where following the rules killed 19 men and survival demanded a price history still argues over. In the late 19th century, the Arctic was not yet a place of warning or restraint. It was a blank space on the map, a region that invited ambition rather than caution. Nations looked north not with fear, but with confidence. Science was advancing, ships were stronger. Men believed that discipline, planning, and obedience could overcome any environment on Earth. It was within this mindset that the expedition led by Adolphus Greely began, not as a desperate gamble, but as a carefully calculated mission meant to prove that humanity could master even the most unforgiving edge of the planet. Greely was not an adventurer in the romantic sense. He was a career military officer, trained to value order, structure, and strict adherence to command. He believed deeply in the power of written orders and chain of command. To him, discipline was not optional. It was survival. When the U.S. Army selected him to lead a scientific expedition deep into the high Arctic, it was precisely because he was not impulsive. This mission was not meant to be heroic. It was meant to be methodical. The goal was clear. A scientific station would be established far north to collect meteorological data, observe magnetic fields, and contribute to an international effort to better understand Earth's climate and geography. The station would operate for several years, supplied annually by relief ships. The men were told, and with absolute certainty, that they would never be abandoned. If a supply ship failed to reach them one year, another would come the next. Orders were written, sealed, and repeated. If relief failed by a certain time, they were to wait. If waiting became impossible, they were to retreat south, according to specific instructions. Nothing was left to interpretation, or so it seemed. In 1881, Greely and 24 other men sailed north and established their base at Fort Conger, one of the northernmost outposts ever attempted at the time. The location itself felt unreal, a world of stone, ice, and silence. There were no trees, no soil, no signs of life beyond the occasional distant movement of Arctic wildlife. Yet, against this backdrop, the men built order. They constructed a station of wood and stone. They organized schedules. They raised flags. They turned the edge of the world into something resembling civilization. At first, morale was high. The men recorded weather patterns, took measurements, and conducted experiments. They hunted when conditions allowed. They ate regular meals. Letters were written with confidence, describing the Arctic as harsh but manageable. The long daylight of summer created an illusion of endless time. Even as temperatures began to fall, there was little fear. Winter was expected. Darkness was expected. Everything unfolding matched the plan. Greely enforced routine with military precision. Each man had a role. Each day followed a structure. This order mattered, especially as the sun dipped lower and eventually disappeared entirely. In the polar night, when darkness stretched for weeks, routine became psychological armor. Without it, the Arctic had a way of pressing inward, erasing time, distorting thought. Greely understood this. He believed that as long as the rules held, the men would hold. The first winter passed without catastrophe. Supplies were consumed carefully. Spirits dipped but did not break. The men trusted that relief would arrive the following year as promised. When the sun returned, optimism returned with it. The Arctic, they believed, had tested them, and they had passed. But the second year felt different. The cold arrived earlier. Ice conditions worsened, wildlife became scarce. Still, the men watched the sea, scanning the horizon for the familiar shape of a relief ship. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Each delay was explained away with reason. Ice could slow ships. Weather could change schedules. No one spoke openly of failure. Failure was not part of the plan. What they did not know, what they could not know, was that far to the south, disaster had already struck. The system designed to keep them alive had broken silently, without warning. The Arctic does not announce its victories. It simply closes in. Inside Fort Conger, life continued with forced normalcy. Measurements were taken. Journals were kept. Meals grew smaller, but not alarming. Greely remained calm, outwardly confident. He reminded the men of their orders. He reminded them that patience was essential, that discipline mattered most when conditions were hardest. Yet beneath the routines, unease began to grow. The men were isolated beyond rescue, surrounded by thousands of kilometers of ice and sea. Communication with the outside world was impossible. Their entire existence depended on a promise made years earlier, a promise they still believed in, because believing in it was easier than imagining the alternative. As the Arctic prepared to tighten its grip once more, the men at Fort Conger stood at the edge of a future they could not yet see. They still believed they were part of a controlled mission. They still believed rescue was a certainty. They still believed that obedience would protect them. They were wrong, and the moment when waiting turned into a fight for survival was already approaching, carried silently on the ice. The Arctic does not fail loudly. It fails in silence, at a distance, far from the men whose lives depend on it. For the expedition stationed at Fort Conger, the second year began with the same assumption that had guided every decision before it. The relief ship would come. It always had. It always would. The system was dependable, the orders were clear, and the men trusted both. Far to the south, preparations were already underway. The relief vessel assigned to resupply the station was Proteus, a ship considered capable by the standards of the time, but still fragile compared to the forces it was about to face. Arctic navigation in the 19th century was a calculated gamble. Captains relied on narrow seasonal windows, reading ice like weather, hoping pack ice would loosen just enough to allow passage. Some years it did, some years it did not. In 1883, it did not. As the Proteus pushed north, the ice closed in faster than expected. Pressure ridges rose like frozen walls. Floes collided and stacked, grinding against the hull. The Arctic Ocean was no longer a surface. It was a moving mass, alive with slow, unstoppable force. The crew fought to maneuver, to retreat, to find open water, but the ship was already trapped. When the ice began to crush inward, there was no dramatic explosion, no storm, no warning signal sent north. The Proteus was simply broken apart and lost to the ice. No message reached Fort Conger. No flare, no smoke, no sign on the horizon. The men continued to wait. Inside the station, time moved strangely. Days were measured by routine rather than sunlight. Measurements were taken, journals were filled, meals were prepared, though portions were reduced slightly, just as a precaution. No one panicked. A delayed ship was inconvenient, not catastrophic. After all, orders accounted for this. If one ship failed, another would come. The Arctic was harsh, but the plan was solid. At least, that is what they told themselves. As weeks passed with no sign of relief, the mood shifted. Not sharply, subtly, conversations shortened. Men lingered longer near the shoreline, scanning the ice even when logic said no ship could appear so late in the season. The silence of the Arctic pressed harder now, no longer a novelty, but a presence that felt watchful. Leadership mattered most in moments like these, and Adolphus Greely remained firm. He reminded the men that they were soldiers as much as scientists, that orders were written for a reason, the instructions were explicit. If resupply failed, they were to remain at Fort Conger until a specified time. Only then, and only under certain conditions, were they to move south. Acting too early could be fatal. Acting too late could be worse. Greely understood the danger of doubt. Once discipline broke, everything else would follow. He kept routines intact, believing structure could hold fear at bay. And for a time, it worked. But winter does not negotiate. As temperatures dropped and darkness returned, food became more than sustenance. It became arithmetic. Every ration was counted. Every meal was weighed against the unknown future. Hunting trips grew longer and less successful. The Arctic was changing, and the men could feel it. The land felt emptier, the silence deeper. Even the wind seemed sharper, as if the environment itself had grown impatient. Still, no one knew the truth. The relief ship was not late. It was gone. This ignorance was perhaps the cruelest part of the disaster. Had the men known that the Proteus lay crushed beneath the ice, their decisions might have changed sooner. They might have broken orders earlier. They might have abandoned Fort Conger while strength remained. But without information, all they had was faith in a system that had already failed them. The waiting became psychological torture. Every sound outside the station sparked momentary hope. Ice cracking, wind shifting, distant echoes that meant nothing. Men dreamed of smoke on the horizon, of masts cutting through fog. Waking from those dreams was worse than never dreaming at all. By the time Greely began to seriously consider retreat, the Arctic had already taken much of what made retreat survivable. Strength had faded. Supplies were dangerously low. The window for easy movement across ice had narrowed. Yet the orders were clear, and Greely obeyed them to the letter. When the moment came, he did not hesitate, but the delay had already written the outcome. The decision to leave Fort Conger was not dramatic. There was no speech, no final ceremony. The men dismantled what they could, packed what remained, and prepared to step into a world that no longer cared about plans or intentions. Behind them, the station stood silent, a monument to belief in structure, in certainty, in promises made far away. Ahead of them lay hundreds of kilometers of drifting ice, open water, and a destination that existed mostly on paper. They left, not knowing that the ship meant to save them had already been destroyed, not knowing that every step south would cost more than the last, and not knowing that the true disaster was only just beginning. Leaving Fort Conger did not feel like retreat. It felt like obedience. The men dismantled what had been their ordered world and packed it into sledges and small boats, convincing themselves that movement itself was progress. What they did not yet understand was that the Arctic does not measure distance the way maps do. South was not a line. It was a negotiation with ice that moved, cracked, and reshaped itself daily. The plan, on paper, was straightforward. Travel roughly 300 kilometers south to reach a known location where supplies were supposed to have been cached. From there, survival would be easier. On charts, the route looked difficult but achievable. In reality, it was a living surface, a frozen ocean fractured into plates that drifted independently, sometimes carrying men backward, even as they marched forward. The departure was slow and heavy. Boats had to be dragged across ice thick enough to bear weight one moment, then suddenly thin enough to swallow a man the next. Supplies were lashed tightly, each item debated before being packed. Every pound mattered, yet everything seemed essential. Food, ammunition, scientific records, personal belongings that no one admitted to needing, but no one could bear to abandon. From the first day, the march revealed its cruelty. Pressure ridges rose ahead like frozen waves, forcing detours that added miles to an already exhausting journey. The ice groaned beneath them, deep sounds echoing from below, reminding the men that they were walking over water that never truly slept. At times, open leads appeared without warning, dark, moving water slicing the ice in half. Each crossing became a gamble. One misstep, one crack too wide, and a man could vanish in seconds. Cold was constant, but it was not the sharpest enemy. Exhaustion was. The act of hauling sledges drained strength faster than rations could restore it. Frostbite crept into fingers and toes, dull at first, then permanent. Boots stiffened. Clothing froze solid overnight. Sleep became shallow, interrupted by shivering and the fear of not waking at all. Illness followed closely behind. Scurvy, already present during the long wait at the station, worsened rapidly. Gums bled, teeth loosened, wounds refused to heal. Men who had marched strongly at the beginning began to lag, then stumble, then collapse into the snow, unable to rise without help. Decisions became harder. Do you slow the group to save one man, or push forward and risk losing him entirely? Leadership under these conditions was less about command and more about choosing which suffering was unavoidable. Adolphus Greely maintained discipline as best he could, but discipline could not create energy where none remained. Orders could not restore blood to numb fingers or warmth to frozen joints. Still, structure mattered. Without it, panic would have spread faster than disease. Days blurred together, distance lost meaning. Men measured progress not by kilometers traveled, but by whether they were still alive at nightfall. Sometimes the ice betrayed them completely. After hours of exhausting labor, they would camp, only to wake and realize the floe had drifted north overnight, erasing a full day's work. Marching forward had become a cruel illusion. As supplies dwindled, rations were cut again. Hunger sharpened tempers and thoughts alike. Conversations grew shorter, stripped of anything unnecessary. Jokes disappeared. Silence took their place. Heavy, absolute and broken only by the sound of breathing through frozen scarves. When land finally appeared, it was not relief so much as grim confirmation. They had reached Pym Island, a place that existed more in orders than in reality. The island was barren, exposed, and cruelly small. The shelter waiting for them was nothing like the solid station they had left behind. It was a crude stone structure, low to the ground, built more as a marker than a refuge. It offered minimal protection from wind and cold, and none from the creeping sense of finality that settled over the group. The men took inventory and realized what no one wanted to say aloud. Supplies were far lower than expected. Some caches had never been placed. Others were inaccessible. The plan had assumed margins that no longer existed. What remained would not last the winter, not even close. Physical weakness was now undeniable. Several men could no longer walk without assistance. Others were reduced to sitting silently, conserving energy, eyes hollow and unfocused. The Arctic night approached again, bringing with it weeks of darkness that no longer felt like a challenge to endure, but a sentence to serve. They sealed themselves into the stone shelter, blocking gaps with snow and scraps of fabric. Wind howled outside, shaking the walls, reminding them how fragile their refuge truly was. Inside, bodies were pressed close together for warmth, yet the cold still found its way in. Hunger gnawed constantly, a presence that never slept. The march was over. The waiting was over. What remained was survival, stripped of movement, stripped of hope, reduced to endurance alone. Pym Island was not a waypoint, it was a boundary, the place where effort ended and consequence began. As the last light faded from the sky, the men understood something that had not been clear before. They had done everything according to plan. They had followed orders. They had marched until there was nowhere left to go. And still, the Arctic had not loosened its grip. Winter did not arrive at Pym Island all at once. It closed in gradually, tightening like a vice. The wind sharpened first, cutting through every seam in clothing and stone. Then the light began to fail. Days shortened until the sun barely lifted itself above the horizon and finally disappeared altogether. What remained was darkness broken only by weak lamps and the pale reflection of snow outside the shelter walls. The stone refuge was never meant to hold men for months. It was low, cramped and uneven, its walls sweating frost that formed thick white crystals along the interior. Breath turned instantly to ice. Anything left unattended froze solid. The men packed themselves inside shoulder to shoulder, not for comfort, but because shared body heat was the only warmth available. Even then, the cold seeped into bones and refused to leave. Food became the center of every thought. Rations were cut again, then again. Portions shrank to a size that barely qualified as a meal. Hunger was no longer a sensation. It was a condition, constant and unrelenting. Stomachs cramped, heads ached. Men chewed slowly, trying to make each bite last, knowing it would not satisfy them no matter how carefully they ate. Hunger stripped time of meaning. Days were measured by meals that were never enough. Scurvy spread rapidly, gums swelled and bled, teeth loosened. Simple movements caused pain. Old cuts reopened and refused to heal, turning black at the edges. Men who had once hauled sledges across ice now struggled to sit upright. Weakness became contagious, not in body, but in spirit. Watching others decline made it impossible to imagine personal survival. Death came quietly at first. A man would grow weaker over days, then slip into long silences, conserving what little energy remained. One morning, he would not respond. In the sub-zero darkness, the line between sleep and death blurred. Bodies froze quickly, becoming stiff and heavy. There was no space to bury them properly, no strength to carry them far. The dead were moved aside, wrapped as best as possible, becoming silent occupants of the same shelter that housed the living. The psychological weight of this was immense. The living ate, slept, and waited only feet from those who had already lost the fight. There was no separation between survival and mortality. Every face reflected a future that felt unavoidable. Leadership under these conditions was nearly impossible, yet Adolphus Greely continued to enforce order. Discipline was no longer about efficiency. It was about preventing collapse. He insisted on record-keeping, on structure, on rules that reminded the men they were still part of something larger than their suffering. Some resented this, others clung to it. Without routine, the darkness threatened to consume thought itself. Hunting offered brief, false hope. Occasional attempts were made when weather allowed, but wildlife had vanished with the light. The Arctic had sealed itself, offering nothing in return for effort. Each failed hunt deepened despair. Every bullet wasted felt like another door closing. As starvation progressed, the body changed in disturbing ways. Faces hollowed, eyes sank deeper into sockets, skin stretched thin over bone. Men spoke less, conserving energy, conserving breath. Conversations that did happen circled the same topics. Food remembered from home, warmth imagined but never felt, sunlight described like a distant dream. Diaries from this period grew shorter and colder in tone. Early optimism vanished entirely. Entries became factual, stripped of emotion. Calories consumed, men ill, men dead. Survival reduced to data. Writing was no longer reflection. It was documentation, as if the writers sensed that someone, someday, would need to understand what happened here. Morality eroded slowly, then suddenly, hunger changes the mind before it destroys the body. Thoughts that once seemed unthinkable began to surface uninvited. No one spoke them aloud at first. Silence did the work instead. When resources approach zero, the line between living and surviving becomes dangerously thin. Winter nights stretched endlessly. Storms battered the shelter, wind screaming across stone like something alive. Snow forced its way through every crack. Inside, men lay awake listening to each other breathe, counting breaths without realizing they were doing it. Each pause felt like a warning, each morning felt like borrowed time. By midwinter, the group was no longer a unit of 25 men. It was a shrinking number of bodies enduring alongside each other, bound not by hope but by necessity. Death had become routine, suffering had become background noise. Yet even in this state, no rescue was visible. No sign came from the south. The Arctic remained indifferent, vast and silent. What the men could not yet know was that winter was not the worst of it. The cold, the darkness, the starvation, these were only the conditions. The true test was what survival would soon demand of them, when endurance alone was no longer enough. And as the darkness deepened around the stone shelter on Pym Island, the line between human restraint and animal necessity began to blur, quietly, irrevocably, and without ceremony. By the deepest stretch of winter, survival on Pym Island no longer resembled life, as the men had once understood it. Hunger had stripped away everything unnecessary: strength, pride, conversation, even emotion. What remained was instinct, raw and persistent, pressing against the last boundaries of restraint. The stone shelter was quieter now, not because the men were calm, but because speaking wasted energy they no longer had. Food was nearly gone. The final rations were measured in fragments, a few ounces divided among men who could no longer stand without assistance. The arithmetic was unforgiving. Even if rescue came tomorrow, many would not live long enough to see it. Bodies had reached a point where recovery was no longer possible. Starvation had passed the threshold from suffering to inevitability. Deaths accelerated. Men who had lingered for weeks finally slipped away, not with drama, but with exhaustion so complete it resembled sleep. Each loss changed the balance inside the shelter. There were fewer mouths to feed, but also fewer hands to work, fewer bodies to share warmth, fewer voices to confirm reality. Survival was no longer collective. It was shrinking inward, isolating each man inside his own failing body. It was during this period that the unspoken became unavoidable. The diaries do not dwell on it. They do not explain. They simply record. Hunger forces decisions long before words are found to justify them. In conditions where the body consumes itself, morality becomes abstract, distant, something remembered rather than felt. The men did not speak openly about what was happening. They did not debate it. Silence covered necessity, because acknowledging it fully might have destroyed what little remained of order. Leadership still existed, though it had changed form. Adolphus Greely understood that once discipline vanished, chaos would follow, and chaos would kill faster than hunger. He maintained control as best he could, enforcing rules even as the physical world collapsed around them. Rations, however small. Records, however brief. Decisions made centrally, not emotionally. To some, this felt cruel. To others, it was the only thing preventing complete disintegration. But command under starvation is never clean. Tensions surfaced. Accusations followed. Weak men were suspected of wasting resources. Stronger men resented carrying those who could no longer contribute. In an environment where survival felt mathematically impossible, every action was scrutinized. Every calorie became a moral question. Punishments were carried out. Authority was enforced, even when it felt unbearable. These moments would later haunt the expedition's legacy more than the cold itself. In the Arctic, judgment is easy from afar and impossible from within. Decisions made under starvation are not choices. In the usual sense, they are reactions to a narrowing tunnel where only one outcome seems possible. The shelter grew emptier. Spring approached, but it did not bring relief. Weak bodies could not take advantage of returning light. Men were too far gone to hunt, too damaged to rebuild strength. The sun returned to a camp that no longer had the energy to welcome it. Light revealed what darkness had hidden. Skeletal frames wrapped in heavy clothing, eyes sunken, skin stretched tight over bone. Survival had etched itself into every face. The waiting continued, but now it was different. Earlier they had waited for rescue with hope. Now they waited with detachment. Some men spoke less not because they were conserving energy, but because they no longer expected anything to change. Survival had narrowed to the present moment, the next breath, the next hour, the next time sleep claimed them. And yet, against all logic, a few endured. Those who remained alive did so not because they were stronger, but because they were luckier, less affected by disease, slightly better nourished, marginally more resilient. Survival was no longer a measure of character. It was a matter of timing and biology. Then, one day, something changed. At first, it was only a sound, distant, unfamiliar, cutting through the Arctic's constant wind, a noise that did not belong to ice or weather. Men stirred weakly, unsure whether the sound was real or imagined. Hallucinations had become common. Hope was dangerous now. It hurt more than it helped. But the sound returned. Movement followed. Dark shapes against the horizon. For those still conscious, the realization came slowly, cautiously, as if approached from a great distance. Rescue was no longer an idea. It was a physical presence, moving toward them across the ice. When the rescue party finally reached the shelter, what they found defied expectation. Of the 25 men who had begun the expedition, only 6 were still alive. And even those 6 were barely recognizable as survivors. They were beyond starvation, beyond exhaustion, held upright only by the thin thread of continued existence. The ordeal was over, but the consequences were not. What had happened on Pym Island would follow the survivors for the rest of their lives. The decisions made in that stone shelter would be examined, judged, debated by people who had never known hunger beyond discomfort, never known cold beyond inconvenience. The Arctic had tested them beyond the limits of preparation, beyond the reach of orders, and in doing so, it revealed a truth as old as survival itself. When the world offers nothing, endurance demands a price. One that is paid long after rescue arrives. What remained now was not the struggle to live, but the reckoning with what survival had required. Rescue did not arrive as triumph. It arrived as shock. When the relief party reached the shattered camp on Pym Island, the scene before them did not resemble an expedition at all. It looked like the aftermath of something unthinkable. Bodies lay frozen where they had fallen. The stone shelter, once a place of last hope, felt more like a tomb. Of the 25 men who had marched south believing obedience would save them, only 6 were still alive. And even they hovered on the edge between survival and death. The rescuers struggled to recognize the survivors as soldiers. Faces were skeletal. Movements were slow, mechanical, driven by habit rather than strength. Some could not stand without assistance. Others stared without focus, as if their minds were still trapped in the long Arctic night. Survival had stripped them down to something fragile and unfamiliar. Among them was Adolphus Greely, barely alive, yet still conscious of command. He had outlasted nearly all of his men, a fact that would later shape how history judged him. In that moment, however, judgment did not matter. What mattered was warmth, food given slowly to avoid killing bodies no longer able to process it and transport away from a place that had claimed almost everyone. The journey back south was quiet. There were no celebrations, no speeches. The survivors were too weak and the rescuers too disturbed by what they had seen. Word of the disaster traveled ahead of them, carried by telegram and rumor. By the time the survivors reached civilization, the world was already waiting, not with relief alone, but with questions. News of the expedition spread rapidly. Newspapers seized on the numbers first. 25 men gone north, 6 returned. The scale of loss stunned the public, but it was the details, slowly revealed, cautiously printed, that ignited controversy. Starvation, disease, executions, and finally the act that would overshadow everything else, The public reaction was divided. Some viewed the survivors with sympathy, recognizing that no one could endure such conditions without crossing lines never meant to be crossed. Others were less forgiving. From warm rooms and full tables, people debated morality as if it were unaffected by hunger. The Arctic became a courtroom, and the men who survived became its defendants. Military inquiries followed. The role of the United States Army was scrutinized. Orders were examined word by word. Why had Greely waited so long before retreating? Why had the supply system failed? Why were there no reliable backup plans? Responsibility shifted constantly, from the ice to leadership to bureaucracy. Greely himself became the center of debate. To some, he was a disciplined officer who followed orders exactly as written, maintaining structure in conditions that would have destroyed weaker leadership. To others, he was a man whose rigid obedience cost lives, a commander who valued rules over adaptation. The truth, as with most disasters, lived somewhere between. What could not be disputed was this: the system had failed long before the men did. The sinking of the relief ship had gone unnoticed. Caches had not been placed as planned. Assumptions had replaced certainty. The expedition was built on confidence rather than redundancy, and the Arctic punished that mistake without mercy. Years passed, but the Greely disaster did not fade quietly into history. It became a lesson written in bodies and ice. Future Arctic expeditions changed their approach. Redundant supply plans became standard. Flexibility was valued alongside discipline. Survival, it was finally acknowledged, required judgment as much as obedience. The ruins at Fort Conger still stand today, silent, weathered, and nearly reclaimed by the Arctic. They do not tell the story loudly. They do not accuse. They simply remain, marking a place where human certainty met an environment that does not care about intention. For the survivors, life never truly returned to normal. The Arctic followed them south, lingering in memory, in reputation, in the knowledge that they had lived through something few could imagine and even fewer could understand. Survival did not feel like victory. It felt like a burden carried quietly for the rest of their lives. The Greely disaster endures, not because of how men died, but because of how they lived, clinging to order in a world that offered none, believing in systems that collapsed without warning, and discovering too late that nature does not negotiate with discipline. They went north to measure the world. Instead, they measured the limits of obedience, leadership, and human endurance. And the Arctic, as it always does, kept the final word.